Hello, this is Erica. Today I'm going to be talking about Beast of the Southern Wilds, which is the 2012 film directed by Ben Zeitlin, and how it connects to wetland media portrayal. Um, so I have a few points I'm going to go through and quickly summarize how they appear in the film, and then spend more time on analyzing how that impacts the portrayal of the wetland. But it's important to point out that there's not a specifically named wetland that appears in this film. The location and time period are both kept ambiguous, which I'll talk more about later. But the film was filmed in Louisiana and represents post Katrina Louisiana in a lot of ways, and pre Katrina for the earlier part of the movie. So we can just generally assume that the film was meant to portray the American South, specifically areas like Louisiana. But it's also important to note that tech really doesn't feature in this film at all. The society is not connected to the larger world in any kind of meaningful way that we can see. Really, to be honest, the most other than when they actually go to like the recovery center, the really only sign we see of the outside world is like beer cans with labels on them to indicate that something exists beyond the bathtub, which is the fictional community where the film centers. But the first specific thing that I want to talk about is a recurring symbol of the aurochs that appear in the movie. So basically, throughout the film, it will cut away from the main story to show this kind of like generated giant beast known as an auroch. And first, they're stampeding, and they just kind of continue to gain power as the film approaches its climax. Um, Now, the Aurochs are discussed when the main character, who's named Hush Puppy, is in her kind of informal schooling environment, which is led by a woman who says something along the lines of that the Aurochs in the old days, the cave people would have to watch as their like cave babies were eaten by them, but they couldn't do anything because they were too poor and stupid. And I think this is an interesting way to describe it by the teacher, whose name is like Miss Bathsheba, I think. Because when we typically think of cave people, we might think of them as like primitive, but I don't think poor and stupid is typically the words associated with it. And I think that's because in this film, the Aurochs represent the progression of climate change and climate change caused or worsened disasters, because we can see as the storm approaches in the film and as the water level rises, this is timed with the aurochs, these magical creatures breaking out of the ice and rushing towards the bathtub. So when she says poor and stupid, I think the teacher is kind of drawing a parallel to how humanity is too like poor and stupid, meaning lacking the resources, and lacking the drive or the care to stop these climate caused disasters. Um, and they just have to sit and watch, similar to how in the film, Miss Bathsheba is among the people that are against the eco-terrorism, which I'll talk about later, and rather just sit and watch as their community becomes more inundated by water. So I think this is interesting, and at the end of the film, they collapse. It's not really clear if they're tired or if they died. But I think this is just kind of leaves questions at the end. This film is definitely has aspects of magical realism. Obviously, we're not supposed to think that the Aurochs are just literally running around, but I think they do represent this kind of impending doom. And at the end of the film, they do manage to put off the destruction of their community by blowing up the levee, which I think is what causes this collapse of the Aurochs, but it's still left into question. The end of the film is very ambiguous about whether the community of the bathtub survives in the long term, although generally it's not super optimistic. So then I want to actually talk about the Hurricane Relief Center. Um, so again, we have this kind of like unnamed storm, which is very Katrina-esque, hit the bathtub, and afterwards they get picked up and brought to this Hurricane Relief Center, which again is kind of the only representation of the water world given in the film. And compared to the bathtub, which we see as a very culturally rich place, we see like a lot of celebrations and the people are very connected, have a sense of community. The Hurricane Relief Center is very sterile. It's got a lot of like white coloring, just like tile, very medical, and the people are separated by screens. And segmented off into their own like familial units. There's also no windows allowing them to connect to nature. So not only is this represented as a very depressing place, but Wink, who is the father of the main character Hush Puppy, is walking through it, and he sees her in this like very bizarre setting. It looks like some kind of like nursery or like very young child school, and we see the children that have been taken are kind of getting like an education there, but it's got a very bizarre like pastel color scheme. It's like I think Hush Puppy's either wearing like pink or a turquoise, kind of very old-fashioned style dress. And again, even though like the time period is not specified in this film, it's very clear that this looks very outdated, very strange and bizarre, with not only the style of the bathtub, but the style of the relief center itself. And what this brought to mind to me when I was watching this film is those images of those like very horrible re-education boarding schools that were established in by colonizers in places that originally had Native American and other Native peoples. Because you see these images and it's like the idea of what is civilized and what is ideal for society. And that was the illusion that was brought to my mind when seeing this, because we see Hush Puppy, who's somebody who lives very free with her family, and the kind of machine of society has like physically forcibly removed her community from the bathtub and brought them to this center, where we get this bizarre, again, bordering on magical realism scene of her in this strange outfit in this strange place. And I think from because it's Wink that witnesses this, her father, we kind of get his horror at seeing what society is doing to his community and to his own daughter. But obviously, eventually they do actually led up to kind of them getting taken away. Arguably, was the eco-terrorism perpetuated by Wink and some of his friends, and ultimately Hush Puppy. So I want to talk about that next. So basically they go to the levee and they use like the corpse of like a big fish stuffed with dynamite to blow up the levee, which causes the water that's being kind of shored up there, which is slowly basically drowning their community and causing people to move out, to drain and kind of bring the land back to its natural state. Um, but I think it's important to recognize that there's a parallel that's drawn between this eco-terrorism led by Wink with the bombing of the levee, and I think an earlier thing that occurs early in the film when Wink is ignoring his daughter for his own medical reasons and other reasons just having to do with his character. There's a scene where Hush Puppy, who has her own house separate from him on the same property, um, actually leaves a pot on the stove, causing it to basically like catch a flame and light the house on fire. And then she goes and hides, and ultimately, like, the house starts to literally burn down. And Wink runs in and is looking for her. And I think that's not eco-terrorism, but I think there's a comparison in the actions of the father and the actions of the daughter earlier in the film, because both of them are done to achieve something. Both of them as the use of physical force, and in both cases, fire, kind of through an almost explosive device to stop something. In the case of Wink, to stop the flooding of his community, and in the case of Hush Puppy, to stop the continued ignoring by her father. So I think it raises the question of, is it a valid, is not just eco-terrorism, but any sort of almost violent or destructive action a valid way to get attention, which I think is interesting because, as we learned, swamps are very much in danger due to problems like, rising sea levels and other things caused by kind of wider society and more urban cities, pollution, all sorts of things. The question is if consistently taking the route of, trying to advocate in government and lobby is not working, at what point does it become acceptable for people who are being forced out of their homes and forced out of their cultures to use more extreme methods? So I think that's interesting. But when Hush Puppy is hiding from her father after she lights the house on fire, I think there's another really interesting scene. She's hiding under a cardboard box and she's writing on it, I think in like crayons, while the house burns down around her. And again, if we look at the house as kind of a parallel to the bathtub at large, to the community at large, like just as it is the home of Wink, the actual house is the home of Hush Puppy, so causing harm to it to protect it. Anyways, she's writing on it and she's talking to herself, and saying like she's going to be remembered, that like she's leaving it for the scientists of the future. And so even after her community somewhat inevitably becomes flooded or destroyed by the advance of wider society, people will get to see this and know that she lived there. I think it's interesting, like her name in this throughout the whole film is Hush Puppy. There's nothing really given to indicate that it's just a nickname. So she's like a very southern name. Like Hush Puppy obviously is like a food, very tied to southern culture. But I think it's interesting that, instead of, being freaked out about the house burning down around her, she just sits and is more important about being remembered. And I think this is again a representation of how people in the South and people living on the coast, especially in swamplands, use art to preserve culture. And the idea that if the actual space and place is inevitably going to be destroyed and inevitably going to be lost, and these communities are going to have to be relocated, like what can be done to preserve the stories and make sure the voices of the people are not lost. And we've talked a lot about how swamps are places of refuge, and communities often didn't choose to end up there, but they ended up there anyways. And so swamp communities often have very um, culturally unique histories and very like things that cannot be replicated, things that are very much tied to the land and the history of that land. So the question I think is it enough to just write on the box? Which I think it's also sadly implied. Obviously, a cardboard box is not likely to survive rising sea levels because it's cardboard. So I think it raises the question of futility and what can actually be done to preserve culture, or is it just doomed to be lost, as the aurochs or approach? But Hush Puppy never wavers in this throughout the film. Another scene, specifically between Hush Puppy and Wink, is when they're kind of having this like party, I think after the storm, to celebrate that they lived, um, where we see other characters using like scissors and tools to open the crab shell to eat it, whereas Wink uses it with his bare hands, and he starts getting mad at Hush Puppy and yelling at her, and he's like, "You have to use your hands," basically. Um, I think this is interesting because we see Wink again, who was the leader of the eco-terrorists, who's very much anti-society. He doesn't want the medical care that is needed for his, unnamed condition, but he is rejecting the use of tools and like I guess the easy way out, instead encouraging his daughter to follow his values and do it herself. And I think it's a big question for the movie is how much of Wink's actions are justified, because he's clearly a very harsh father and he doesn't really express a lot of love towards Hush Puppy. But we can kind of take this as like it's a hard world that they live in. Like they're living in a swamp. They fish for their own food. They're not given, we don't know to what degree the technology exists in other cities, but they are cut off from it. They're cut off from medical care largely, or like the life-saving medical care that's needed. Um, so I think it's kind of to what extent is Wink just training her for a world that's not only already difficult, but getting increasingly hard to stay in as as the bathtub floods, as the ice melts, as fish become more scarce. So those were the main specific points I thought were important in the film. But I think just like looking back, I think the wetland more generally is portrayed as a very important place in this film. I mean, it's a film about a swamp, so I wouldn't say it's even the setting as much as it is the point of the film. Really, the only time we leave is very shortly for the Hurricane Relief Center, which is portrayed again as a bad place. But Hush Puppy really has an appreciation for the beauty of the world around her, and she's, very not freaked out by animals. She's very, willing to get her hands dirty, and I think it's not seen as like a nasty thing. It's seen as like a beautiful thing. And I think Hush Puppy is portrayed as kind of the hope and the future of this society. So I think even if this wetland is not necessarily a safe place and it is somewhat dangerous, I mean, we see the procession of cars leaving when the storm comes, and we see how like destructive that storm is. It's still shown as kind of the only option, right? There is no alternative given. We're not shown like a nice like a bunch of like beachside condos that people can live in instead. It's kind of shown, I think, that the swamp is the community, and therefore the wetland needing to be protected is of utmost importance, hence to why they ultimately bomb the levee. Um, but yeah, portrayals of the people I think are also interesting. We see a very diverse community, and I don't think it's specifically tied to any like exact, specific, explicitly said real world like community or culture, but I think we see just a lot of general elements of like what is considered Southern culture portrayed. Some of them, the old men are seen as kind of like not I don't know if yeah, I guess somewhat stereotypically, caricatures of like country hicks, not necessarily in a negative way, but like, they're drinking and they're, falling in the water and they're not willing to leave the swamp. But I think generally the portrayal of the characters is somewhat positive, especially even with Wink, who we see, he's quite rude to his daughter, to put it lightly, and he's very stubborn. But still, we see his passion come through for protecting his home and for protecting his daughter, and we see that he really does care about her. We also through the teacher that I spoke about earlier can see like there is a sense of community being fostered and a sense of education being, passed on, even if it's not in the traditional boarding school style sense. We see that knowledge is important. So I'd say that people are not portrayed as dumb. They're portrayed as very tied to the land, though. At the final scene of the film, we're not really explicitly told what's happening or what the outcome is, but we see them marching, still as one community. And even though Wink dies at this point or is dead at this point, we can see that the events of the film did not fracture or destroy that community. So ultimately, I think Beast of the Southern Wild is an important film because it shows kind of in raw honesty the difficulties of climate change, and other problems affecting, coastal communities in general, as well as how the culture of the people there is both vibrant and under threat. I think Hush Puppy represents the younger generation. And while she does, give us optimism and is willing to stand against, the aurochs that generally seem kind of insurmountable to a lot of people, including the teacher who tells her about them. I think it shows that, there is a way, but I think the film wants us to question to what extreme we have to go to protect these environments. Um, because it's only through this ecological terrorism that they're actually able to prevent their home from being completely submerged. So, yeah, thank you.